Welcome back to another episode of Rameumptom Ruminations. I'm the host, Scott. Today's episode is a little different. Today's episode is an interview I had with Gary Stone over at Topic Discuss. Thanks for coming back to another episode. The format of this one is a little bit different. I was interviewed last night, July 29th, over at the podcast Topic Discuss by Gary Stone. He wanted to discuss about morality and ethics. So I joined him on his podcast and we had an excellent chat about a wide variety of topics. So this episode is the audio from that interview. Gary Stone is a great guy. It was a fun chat that we had together, and I recommend, after listening to this episode, going and checking out his podcast. You can go find it on YouTube and wherever you find podcasts. It is called Topic Discuss. And so I'm going to transition now into the interview.
Hi, Scott.
Hey, how are you?
Welcome to Topic Discuss.
Thanks for having me.
So, Scott, the topic that I've been given to discuss is morality. And so you and I are going to discuss that topic. And I think that the concept of morality is really interesting to talk about, right?
Mm-hmm.
And as I was preparing for this episode, and I have been for a while, you can kind of dive into Aristotle or to Socrates or to early philosophers, and then you can kind of get into what are ethics, and you can look at modern philosophy. But I had an opportunity to listen to you on a podcast talk about morality, and I was hooked. So I'm gonna turn the time to you to introduce yourself in whatever way you would like, and take the lead on the discussion.
Well, I'm Scott. I'm the host of a podcast called Rameumptom Ruminations. I also do another podcast. I haven't mentioned it too much, but I do a live play D&D podcast with a couple of buddies. That one's called 12-Sided Guys. So I post an episode on each of these every week.
For my kids that are watching, just to say that again, you do D&D.
Yeah, Dungeons and Dragons. Yep.
Yeah. My kids have been wanting to do it, so we'll have to share that with them.
Yeah, so there's lots of different live plays that you can listen to. Basically, people record themselves playing with their friends and they post the episodes. It's a blast. We're doing it as a fun hobby. We were already playing anyway. But yeah, so those are the two podcasts that I run. Rameumptom Ruminations is more centered towards religious deconstruction, specifically the Mormon religion. I grew up Mormon. I was raised in that faith tradition. As I learned more about history, I found myself believing less and less in religion. And it was almost kind of like an even transition. As the more I learned about the history of the world, the less I believed in the histories that I was told as a child. I kept it nuanced, and what I mean by that is for me, religion is a construct to bring cultures and families and societies together. And these shared stories that they tell, I think the original purpose, less than talking about history, because history as we know it wasn't invented until Herodotus started doing it around, I'm not looking this up, it's right around 500 BCE. But before that time, people weren't writing histories. They were writing tales and myths about their gods to teach lessons, to teach people what the important things were for their cultures. So I still looked at the Mormon religion and religion in general as these shared myths to talk about what was important for people to believe and how to act in society. So even though I didn't myself necessarily believe in God, I saw the value in many of the systems. On the flip side, there were many aspects of it that were harmful. And part of my motivation of making my podcast is to speak out against those harmful systems while doing it in a way for a believer or a nuanced believer or someone who just doesn't know and hasn't decided might be able to listen and see things from different angles. So in my podcast, Rameumptom Ruminations, I try and present every aspect from a couple of different angles.
So when you talk about the history and when documentary history really started, it was around 500 BC. Prior to that, they were oral traditions, mythologized, and today we even see some of that still exists through Native American culture.
Of course,
much of that is oral history. There's a lot of mythology to tell a tale, but just because that in their mythology a Sasquatch exists does not make Sasquatch real.
Exactly. I think there's an important distinction. You can believe something is true, but that doesn't mean it's true. I could believe that the earth is flat. That will never make it flat. No matter how much I believe in it, it will never change the fact that it's not flat.
Yeah. So when you started to let's just talk a little bit historically then. In any of your studies, when did, from your perspective, scholars or philosophers really begin to talk about morality, and who really, or from your perspective, why did that really become defined?
Well, so in my opinion, I think morality and the study of ethics, which is basically just the study of morality, religion has been doing that since the beginning of time. If you look at any faith traditions, they're trying to say, this is what we're supposed to do, this is what we're not supposed to do. And they come up with many different reasons for why you should or shouldn't do a thing. So I think it actually started with faith traditions and was later separated from them by the philosophers that we mentioned. But it started in its inception with religious texts and religious leaders saying, this is what we should do, this is what we shouldn't do, because God said so. And whatever God that might be, I mean, we can go to the East or the West, whatever faith tradition it is, at its core, they're trying to teach people how to live a good life. Morals and ethics start there, I think.
I'm going to just throw this out there, and I have viewers that might correct us, or other podcasters that would know more than this. But in my study of world religions and morality, I agree with you. Right? There's a social construct that it's almost a way of managing a society and a culture. You do that through religion and politics to a degree. But there's one religion that really created a set of rules that were pretty arbitrary and called them a morality code, and it's Judaism, right? The Abrahamic religion. When you really look at like other Semitic religions or religions that were in the Levant at the time and other cultures, the code of ethics and the morality related to how we're going to interact with nature, right? And explaining storms and tornadoes and lightning that ruin your crops, and morality around how you treat each other and just maintaining society, right? And managing society. But when you look at the code of ethics and moral codes and moral law within Judaism, when you read the Old Testament, they really are so arbitrary. People think the Ten Commandments is really it, but that's not it. It's, don't milk your goat or feed your mother's goat to your, you know what I mean? Like completely arbitrary, that really it didn't make any sense. And I don't know why that happened. We'd have to have some ancient Jewish scholars teach us why that happened.
I think you get some remnants of the Code of Hammurabi in what's happening in the Old Testament there, where they're trying to set up a system, a society, and have rules for everything that happens, rules for how how you can beat your slave and how close you can get to killing them without getting in trouble. And there's rules for all of these random things in the Old Testament that a lot of them are taken and reinterpreted from them looking at the Code of Hammurabi and adapting that to their culture. So it's them taking these morals of society and incorporating them with their religion, with their beliefs. And they did it on a way of like, you will be unclean if you do this. You have to go and have a priest cleanse you, or things along those lines if you break the rules.
So are you saying then that morality is invented by humans?
So there's a lot of different ways that we can look at this. I think the way that most people, so the question you posed at the beginning was that many people that believe in God, they think that God is the only real way to get to morality. And that type of ethics is typically referred to as supernaturalism or God-based ethics. It's a theory that God dictates what the ethics are, and we have to follow them. He is the only, or she is the only source of morality, and they determine what is right and wrong. And the only way to lead a good life is by doing what God says. So that type of code of ethics is called supernaturalism. And that's what most of the world followed for a long time.
And the supernatural meaning either that could be the gods of lightning, or it could be a monotheistic God.
Yeah, right? It could be any of the pantheons around the world. Monotheism is kind of a new invention that the ancient Israelites were actually polytheistic, and then they switched to henotheism. But this code, these supernatural beings, whoever they are, whatever the thought system is, if you say morality is determined by a supernatural force, be it God or whatnot, then that would be supernaturalism. And there's some problems with that. One of the famous ones that I discussed on my podcast is the Euthyphro dilemma. It's Socrates chatting with a guy named Euthyphro, and he poses the question basically, could God ask you to do something that's bad? And if he did, would it be bad? If God said, you need to go and murder this person, and then you go and do it, is that thing good? God said so. God told you to do it. Does it become a good thing because God said so?
So we have examples of that throughout religions, right?
Yeah, and then some of the softer ones, you could say just the changing of commandments. Throughout history, if you study the Old Testament, the New Testament, Christianity today, Christianity throughout the ages, or any religion throughout the ages, they're going to have slight shifts in what they believe. Each new religious leader is going to talk about what's important to them, and he's going to add his or her perspective to the conversation, and it's going to slightly change what things are important to God and what isn't, based on whatever this religious leader is teaching. For example, you might have one person come in and say, oh, we're going to have this code that says we can only wear this type of clothes. Like you have in Leviticus, it says you can't mix your cloths. You can only wear one type of fabric at a time. If you don't, it's a sin. And then you have the next prophet come in and say, no, we're just kidding. We're not going to do that anymore. Well, then which one was from God?
Right.
And so the implication of this is, if God can come down every couple hundred years and say, you know what, I changed my mind, we're going to go in this whole new direction, what is to stop him from becoming a monster and commanding us to do terrible things? So if God can command us to do anything, and anything that he commands us to do is good, he becomes indistinguishable from a monster. You cannot distinguish his motives from that of a villain.
So Scott, I just want to press on that for just a minute, because what that really means is that, because I know that there will be viewers who are going to say, well, not my religion, right? But I think it's important to just kind of highlight that this is a supernatural form of morality, or assuming that morality comes from a new supernatural source, we have evidence throughout history in every single religion, in every, there's no exception, because the supernatural forces are your source for morality. Anything goes. Murder, beheading people, polygamy, whatever you want to call it, that's the fallacy you're saying of a supernatural source for morality. If God says it's good, then it's good. And when God says it's not good anymore, then that's fine too.
Yeah.
But then the messenger that's channeling God, could be a tyrant or whoever, right? And lead us down a bad path.
Yeah. So I think the simple solution to this, gods and the supernatural, we need to separate them from the leaders that are talking and like teaching us about them. When we have a code of morals, let's just say, we're not going to go dig too deep into the ethics. If there's a code of rules that God would uphold, whatever these rules might be, perhaps they are more eternal than the rules that religions present us with regularly. So, for example, if your religion says you're not going to be worthy if you don't drink, you're not going to be worthy if you drink coffee, that hasn't been a rule for the entire history of humanity. So why does it matter now to God that people do that? I think we impose God's will on societal norms where, if there is a God, I don't think he cares if you drink coffee or not. It's probably a problem in presentation with what prophets and religious leaders say, but we read God into the words of man. So if there is a God,
right,
he would be more consistent. I would envision him or her as being much more consistent than what is presented by many of the religions today.
Well, and so going back to Socrates, I think that's interesting, because that was right around the time there was this Hellenistic influence that we saw in Christianity, which is probably a whole nother topic.
The Jews were in captivity by the Assyrians and the Babylonians from like 700 and then 500, and then when the Persians conquered, they freed all the Jews, told them to go home and rebuilt their temple. So they were under Persian rule. Then when Alexander the Great came around and conquered the world, came from the other direction, then he Hellenized the whole known world. And so from 300 BCE, you have this Greek influence on the entire world, and that hasn't gone away since then.
Right. And so that Greek influence included these Greek philosophies, right? Where Greek philosophers were coming forward and saying, yeah, we think we can explain the natural world with math and science, what they thought of as math and science. And we really should. And I don't know that they necessarily didn't believe in God. Some did and some didn't.
Yeah, the majority of them did.
Yeah, they separated God from science and philosophy, saying there's a way to explain famine. There's a way to explain, and then therefore there's a way to mitigate those issues, right?
Yeah, to your point, Hippocrates, the same for the Hippocratic Oath. His major contribution was not understanding the way the body works. He understood less than many of his contemporaries. The Egyptians really understood how the body worked. But what Hippocrates did that was different is he started using observations. And he tried to say, basically his contribution was saying, regardless if the gods influence the diseases and the illnesses that I'm seeing or not, I need to observe them and figure out what's happening. And from him on, it basically established this scientific method that we have today, where they believed in the gods. They just ignored them when they were doing science, if you will, or rather they were trying to understand the world and see what rules operated everything.
Yeah. Yeah, it's there's just this separation, and it's hard to explain in our context because we live in the 21st century.
Yeah.
Right? But they created that separation, and like you said, making observations and recognizing this person has a disease that wasn't caused by a demon, possession, or caused by a god, or the supernatural. I like that you use the word supernatural, because it's any supernatural intervention. They really were saying, no, there's a observable natural explanation.
Well, part of it too is they would say things such as, even if Zeus cursed us and this is happening, what he has done, we can measure it and observe it. Even if it's a demon possession, or even if it's a witch, here are the things that we can do to figure out if it's really a witch. Do they float in holy water? Things like that. Like they would use science to the best that they could. They were limited in the way that they assumed these supernatural things had more of an influence on the world than they did.
So then, as we kind of think more about morality, and so are there other forms of morality you can expound on?
Yeah. Okay. So there's a lot of different types of morality, a lot of different ways that people come to conclusions about what is right and what is wrong. And I can briefly go through a couple of them. What inherently makes stealing wrong? Is it the action itself? Is it the consequences of it? Yeah. So what inherently makes stealing
Are you
wrong?
Harming someone else? Yeah. Right? Are you harming someone else? Or Well,
what's your motive to do it?
Yeah. Do you know you're stealing if you do it?
Yeah. So there's all these things kind of go into it. And so basically the way morality can be summarized, or there's a bunch of different, if you will, schools of thought. The first one I'll talk about is the deontological ethics. These are like duty-based. So what this would be is, regardless of the consequences, regardless of the motives, there is a set list of things that are right and wrong. For example, like traffic laws of your local city or your state. These would be like duty-based rules that you're just supposed to follow because it's the right thing to do, regardless of your motive, regardless of the consequences of you following those rules. And so that would be deontological, and that's like, regardless of outcome, regardless of motive, it's the right thing to do always.
But where do the list of right things to do come from in that model?
Well, in that model, you would have to debate, and a lot of people talk about it and they come up with different lists and such, but they typically try and come up with what would be good things to do at their core. So if you'd say that we are duty bound to never lie, then lying would be inherently wrong, regardless as if you lied and it made someone feel better. Like, it would still be wrong to lie. So that would be like the deontological
approach to it. Yeah, because you could also lie to survive. Right?
Of course. Yes.
Right.
Yeah. So you could lie to survive, but it would still be wrong based on these duty-based ethics. I wouldn't consider myself part of this camp. The next one, the next way to look at morality is called consequentialism. I mentioned this one briefly, but it's basically, you can determine if a thing is right or wrong based on the consequences of the action. A camp that a lot of people fall into would be like utilitarianism. It's basically whatever action does the most good is the right action to take. In war, lots of people get killed, but if you're fighting a tyrant, it's okay because you're killing bad guys. Those are air quotes for those that are just listening. It's okay to kill a tyrant because you're doing more overall good, but normally it wouldn't be okay to kill. So that's kind of the idea of consequentialism. And in this also, it would be okay to lie if it did enough good to counterbalance the negative effects of it.
Could that include the ends justify the means? Definitely.
That is 100% the ends justify the means. Yes.
I don't know that I like the ends justify the means.
I don't either. And I've saved the one that I like the best for last.
Okay.
But we'll go through a couple of them before we get there. The next one is called subjectivism, and the best way to describe this is from a John Steinbeck quote. He wrote The Grapes of Wrath, and it's just this 2-sentence snippet. It says, "There ain't no sin and there ain't no virtue. There's just stuff people do." So basically, the idea of subjectivism is right and wrong are just constructs of humanity, of society, and any sort of morality we ascribe to an action says more about the way we look at culture than the action would do. A lot of people, when they look at, the natural world, they kind of look at it like this, because who is to say what's right and wrong? And, outside of humanity, if we're looking at, laws of morality for toads or for whatever it is, bacteria, even the laws of morality that we would put on ourselves are not going to match up. So it's all subjective. So that's what subjectivism asserts. Then the last one, and I like this one the best. This one's virtue ethics.
So this is your favorite one.
This one is my favorite one, and
okay,
it's pretty simple. It says a right act is the action a virtuous person would do in the same circumstances.
So define virtuous.
We could debate for hours on that, but I think in my mind, these virtue ethics, it's someone who is good and kind and who has practiced their kindness and who has practiced serving others and who has practiced telling the truth and picking up the trash that they see on the side of the road. The person who's practicing these daily virtues of being a good citizen for their city, a good neighbor to their friends around them, a person that's practicing these virtues is just going to know the right thing to do in any given situation. Whether that right thing to do is hard or not, that depends on the situation. But someone who is practicing kindness, who is genuinely considering other people, is just going to do the right thing.
That includes kind of our innate ability to have empathy.
The other side of virtue ethics that I think is really important is it acknowledges that people can make mistakes. And sometimes they might act in a way that's not virtuous. That's just how people are. We've observed human nature. Everyone is sometimes not nice. That's just how it is. But in virtue ethics, you look at a person's overall character. So everyone's going to have a bad day, but you can trust that a virtuous person is going to do the right thing more often than the wrong thing, just because they're practicing these daily kindnesses and these daily niceties to be a good citizen and a good neighbor.
Yeah. And so I just want to kind of like explore virtue ethics as this kind of platform or model for morality. Because part of where my mind goes a lot with human behavior is evolution and how we became what we are today. In comparison, because we make comparisons with other animals. I've talked before in some of my podcasts about oxytocin, for example, and how oxytocin is kind of a neurotransmitter that bonds us together through physical touch and through other, kind of reproduction and other things. And so and it all relates to survival and society and how we can survive and thrive and excel as a species. And so are you saying, or do you see within the human nature and in how we've evolved that virtue ethics? And that's why I bring up empathy, because empathy is somewhat of a survival mechanism in terms of survival of the species and bonding with our children and those kinds of things. So make that connection further with virtue ethics and evolution.
Yeah. So I think the subject of morality is something we discuss because we're trying to understand these evolutions that have happened within us. We have been raised in these family units. We have been with evolution, we have learned these traits that have helped us survive. And I think, in my opinion, that the study of morality is just understanding what those things really mean. Like, what does empathy really mean? And how does empathy portray itself in a complex society? You know, when we were climbing down from the trees and taking our first steps as mankind, why did empathy help us then? And why did it stick with us? Or, you know, whenever it was learned, whenever it was added to the human race, those things that helped then would look very different than what helps us today. And so I think the study of ethics is just understanding how these ideas like empathy and families and duty, what they look like in a really complex society.
So they're theoretical frameworks and theoretical models, right? Because if we use evolution just a little bit further, when I look at I talk about my parents' dogs all the time on the podcast, and I see these two dogs. They're fairly old, and you know they connect with us more so than cats would. Part of that is oxytocin. Part of that's oxytocin is released in a dog when you pet it, not so in a cat.
That had to have been learned somewhere.
It had to have been a favorable gene that expressed itself, and part of why dogs are in a pack and that kind of thing. But they fight over food. But then when you look at chimpanzees, that they're very closely related, the most closely related species to humans, and they share food. In fact, it's part of their pair bonding, right? When they take a bite, they want you to take a bite, right? Or each other. And it's part of this bonding experience that we relate to. Like when I watch a chimpanzee, feed its human friend, he takes a bite and gives his human friend a bite. I really relate to that. That's part of our species and how we bond and create, and we do bond over food. We see that throughout many cultures. And again, because that evolutionary process creates a society that particular species needs in order to survive and thrive and create these social bonds. And I think what you're saying is, yes, we have evolved as a human species to have very, very complex brains, complex enough that we're aware of our own consciousness, we're aware of our own morality. And we see this in Enkidu and the Epic of Gilgamesh, right? That whole epic is about Gilgamesh realizing mortality is real, and he's going to die too because his friend Enkidu dies.
In the Epic of Gilgamesh, when I was reading he exclaims, and it's just so like gut-wrenching, when his friend dies, and it's this moment of, I'm never going to see my friend again, but I'm going to die too. And it's just like, I was reading it, I was just in tears. Like, it's just such a powerful moment in literature.
That awareness makes us so complex and unique in the animal kingdom. And therefore we then begin to try to make sense of this, which is what Gilgamesh was doing, and many other religions have done, and religious leaders is, I have got to explain this, and I got to figure out how to survive. I mean, we've evolved with these mechanisms to survive. But then when we realize that we're mortal and that we are going to die, all our brain can think is, we can't die. We got to survive because our primitive brains want to survive.
Yeah. It's almost a competition between the primitive brain and the cognitive brain.
Right. And that cognitive brain is where these social constructs and this higher level of thinking, I guess, comes from. And what I think you're saying is that there are various theoretical frameworks to try to explain this and figure out how do we live together in society. And so therefore, we really do, as a human species, make up morality. Moralities, whether it's supernatural morality or virtuous morality, it is coming from us in an attempt to explain why we are who we are, why we are what we are, and why we need each other.
It's also an attempt to express a framework of what the ideal person would interact in any given situation, or how to figure out what the ideal action would be in any given situation. And so someone who approaches it through like the virtue ethics lens is going to use all of the tools. He's going to look at the consequences of the action. He's going to look at the motivation of the action. He's going to look at the action itself and weigh all of these things and use all of the tools of these other ways of viewing morality in order to come to a good judgment of what is right and what is wrong. Going back to the supernatural side of things, there was one more point that I wanted to make about this is oftentimes when you say that God is the one that dictates your morality, the choices that you make that are right are transactional. And what I mean by that is someone is going to obey the commandments because it will get them into heaven or because it will keep them from going to hell. Now, that isn't the motivation for everyone. I don't want to say that as a blanket statement for everyone, but many people, the reason that they don't sin is because they don't want to go to hell. And so
right.
The question then is, if you're doing a good thing for a bad motive, is it still a good thing?
Right. And that's another fallacy of supernatural morality.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, and I also think many people that I know who will say, well, the reason that I do something good is because I believe I will be blessed with some reward in this life. Like if I don't drink coffee, then I'm going to be rewarded with some other thing, right? Or if I pay my tithes to my church, then I'm going to be blessed with more money or wealth, or that's prosperity gospel kind of ideas. But it's still, it's supernatural.
Yeah,
it's a supernatural hope.
Mm-hmm. But then it changes the motivation for doing whatever the action is. And so there's an interesting thought experiment to look into this. Let's say there is a child drowning in a lake. And a person walks up, they see the child drowning. Of course, it's not going to be any harm to them. They're going to run out to the lake. They're going to save the kid. What if this same person earlier that day was hypnotized, and the hypnosis put over them was, if you see a child drowning, you have to go and save the child, essentially becoming like a robot, if you will. This same person goes and sees the child without thinking, without processing, goes and saves the child. Is it a good action? Because there was no motivation for it. They were compelled to do it.
Right.
And so on one hand, you do have if you will, like a net morality of saving a kid. That's a good thing to do. But for the action for them personally, the person that did the saving, would it be chalked up as a good thing because they didn't control it? They were basically a robot in this situation. And you can take it even further. You can say, you go and you see this child drowning, and someone pulls a gun on you and says, you have to save this child or I will shoot you. And so, of course, I don't want to get shot. And so you run and you save the kid. Was that a good action? You did it because you were going to get shot. And the same thing could say, it's you walk up, there's two people there. One says, oh man, I don't want to get my clothes wet here. I'm going to pay you $100. You go and save that kid. I'm going to stay here. And then the person takes $100, sure, goes and saves the kid. They got paid to save the kid. It's laughable. But this is the way morality is presented within Christianity. You do a bad thing, you're going to be shot. You're going to hell. You do a good thing, you're going to get money. You're going to go to heaven. And we laugh at it because neither one of those is a moral choice, because you're being rewarded or punished. It's transactional. It is purely for your own benefit when you look at it like that. I think when Christianity looks at morality from this lens, they lose the point, because that is not what Christ taught at all. He taught in the Sermon on the Mount, let not your right hand know what your left hand does. Do thy good deeds in secret. This whole sermon has a long stretch where he's basically saying, do good for the sake of good. And he does say you'll be rewarded, in heaven, and there is talk of reward, but the motives for it that he's talking about, he's trying to reframe it in a very interesting way. But I feel like people who look at morality transactionally like this have missed the point of what Christ was trying to teach.
Going back to virtue your concept of or it's not, I guess it's not just yours, but your favorite
Yeah.
concept is virtue ethics or virtue morality. And I think what's interesting to think about is, or what I feel like that you're saying is you're using data, like you're weighing all of the different scenarios around you and using data to kind of determine in this situation what would be the most virtuous thing.
No, yeah. So what you're saying is spot on. Again, I'm going to go back to Socrates because he said it real well. Now, this quote it's what people say he said during his trial when he was sentenced to death. And in that trial, he's quoted as having said, "The unexamined life is not worth living." And as you said, it's looking at the data. It's examining who you are as a person, why you're acting the way you're acting. Is the way you're acting harming other people, even unconsciously, even if it's not your motive? Is it hurting people? And should you change? Would it hurt you to change to be a better person? Looking at your life and looking at the world around you to try and be a better person. And that's what I see as virtue ethics. And it is, like you said, you're looking at the data, you're using all of these other forms of ethics and determining right and wrong to practice doing what's right and wrong. And that's the key with virtue ethics is someone who's practicing doing the right thing is going to continually do more of the right things.
Where do you see virtue ethics being practiced the most in societies?
Oh man. Nowhere. I'm sorry. I honestly, one of my biggest frustrations with the way people are is wherever you go, people are just not nice. And that isn't everyone as a whole, but if you're looking at the political spectrum, if you're looking at different countries, if you're looking at whatever the paradigm you want to look at, we as humans fail to see other humans as humans. If you identify as Republican or Democrat, you can't look at the person from the other party and see them as a person. And I feel like, unfortunately, the society we live in, interconnected with the internet and everything the way it is, I don't see ethics being practiced. I don't see it.
So what do you think? Why do you think that is, especially in today's world?
Honestly, I think a big part of it is the way the algorithms and a lot of the apps that we use, Facebook and whatever it is, they get more views if they're angry, or they get more views, more attention if it's going to be a jab at someone who disagrees with them. And the way we have built our society around instant gratification for dehumanizing other people, just the way so many of the systems are built are just not for the people. And I think it's a core problem with our society, but it's not a new problem. This is not new. It's just got new ways of manifesting, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
All throughout history, this has been the way we've treated each other.
So I'm going to just reference Roger Plotho. I don't know how many viewers or if you've watched that. We actually spend time. It's the title of that show is the Avoiding Apocalypse, because social media and the fact that we live in the information age has really compounded these problems, right? Where we are invoking a unreal or supernatural source to use it to determine how we're going to behave. We're seeing this right now in the pandemic and vaccines and masks. People are invoking this source from online to make a decision about how they're going to act and behave. And it's easy at that point to demonize anyone else. And it's just exacerbated the problem because they're not willing to really vet their source or critically think. So what are your thoughts then? What my hope of the future is that as we think more critically and learn how to have empathy and learn how to improve society, Sometimes I like to think about what the universe that people live in on Star Trek, the
Oh
Next
man,
Generation, right? Where
that's the goal. That's the goal.
they've abandoned superstition, and they're accepting, and they've learned how to use technology to eliminate scarce resources. What are your thoughts about how we move forward with virtue ethics? Because our organizations, including religions, have really failed us in this area.
Oh yeah, 100%. Oftentimes throughout history, it has been these religious organizations that have been the impetus for some of the most heinous crimes against humanity that have ever been committed. But what do we do? What do we do about this?
Yeah. How do we move forward?
Yeah, how do we move forward? For me, I have decided to maintain a tone with the podcast that I produce of neutrality and acceptance in the space that I exist in. Sometimes they're not always nice to people that disagree with them. They don't always give credence or space to someone who disagrees with them. And I don't think that's healthy. And I don't think that that is what would engender this sort of world that we're talking about, this Star Trek utopian society. The rhetoric and the tone that I talk in when I'm creating content that would be heretical or, basically against religion, I'm trying to do it in a way where I present the topics and I speak about it kindly, gently, and allow space for someone to disagree with me, allow space for a believer to say, okay, even though these are the facts, I still believe. And if you can look at someone who disagrees with you, recognize that you're never going to agree on this and still love the person, still accept the person, I think those are the first steps to making a better society. That's not the example we get in politics. That's not the example we get in, international discourse that we have. It's hatred. It's they're the enemy. But if we could just stop for a second and recognize that someone who might disagree with you vehemently might also love the exact same TV show that you love. They're a human. They're a person. We could be on complete different sides of the political spectrum, but we've just established that we both love Star Trek. So we at least have that in common. But it's so much more than that. We are humans. We have so much in common. And these constructs of political parties and nations and these identities, they're made up. They're 100% made up.
Right.
And when you look at the Star Trek, this example that we're saying, they did away with all of that because they saw that they were made up, and they made one humanity. And until we can get to any sort of ideal like that, I think we're going to have problems.
I know that some of my viewers will think, well, it's just so overwhelming. What will fix it all is when Jesus comes again.
Yeah. I mean, that is one way to look at it. But no, I personally don't believe he's coming back. That's my belief. But for a person that does believe, what if we created this utopia and Jesus came back and was like, whoa, guys, you did it. Good job. Would you rather him say that, or would you rather him come down and just crush everyone?
Right.
If I was a believer, if I'm someone who is waiting for this moment for Christ to come back, I want the world to be good. I want the world to be ready. I don't want my neighbors to burn.
I love what you're saying. Yeah, because what have we done? If you are going to be a believer, and your answer cannot be, well, Jesus is going to come and fix it. You fix it.
Exactly.
You fix it. Right?
Because that goes right back to these, basically the immorality of trusting a deity to give you commandments. If you're saying, I can't do anything, and you're pushing all of the responsibility off on God, you have no reason to be a good person. You have no reason to try and save an endangered species. The morals of just sitting and doing nothing are so much worse than someone who, even if you believe he's coming back, someone who stands up and fights for equality, someone who stands up and fights for an endangered species, that person has a far more superior set of morals than someone who just says, nah, Christ is going to fix it. Nothing I can do.
There's nothing I can do except say my prayers.
Yeah.
That might be heretical to some, but
Yeah.
I think, yeah, because I think the other thing too that I really like what you said is, and you do this very well in your podcast. You talk very calmly and straightforward, and then you do give space for people to think. One of the solutions that I have, I guess, when I think about morality and ethics and everything that we're doing, we have the ability up here. We have these incredible brains. Now you
Mm-hmm.
can believe that these brains were gifted to you by a creator, or you can recognize that our brains evolved to be what they are today. We can use this intelligence that we have and this higher level of thinking and this empathy that we have to make decisions that relate to how we treat each other, right?
Mm-hmm.
And how we think about each other, and how we are going to figure out how we're going to live together going forward. It doesn't really matter, what societies existed in the past. It doesn't really matter. I mean, we can talk about Socrates for a frame of reference,
Yeah.
but then the question becomes, what do we do in the 21st century, and
Mm-hmm.
how do we figure out how we're going to live together?
It's just practice. If every single person on this planet can just practice being nice, practice listening to someone who disagrees with them, practice trying to examine their lives to see if what they're doing is helpful or harmful. It's these daily disciplines. It's reflecting at the end of the day, was I a good person today? Did I make the right choice? Not beating yourself up if you made a mistake, but saying, can I be better? What could I do to be better? If everyone just tried to be a little bit better, we could create this Star Trek utopia. Because in my mind, I don't believe in a traditional heaven, but that looks like heaven to me. If we can create a society where people can respectfully disagree and love someone who they don't get along with, if we can live in a society where these social constructs just aren't there anymore and people are just humans, that is heaven to me. And I think that's the goal when people study ethics and try and help other people find a higher moral ground, if you will.
I want to pick your brain a little bit further about that, because this is giving us something we can take with us after today's episode, right? Practice. It's a matter of practicing virtue ethics every day. And for me, when I think about, okay, I want to practice virtue ethics every day, and what difference did I make today? When I kind of think about how I would do that, I realize that a lot of what impacts how I'm feeling and what I'm doing is what's going on in my brain and what I'm thinking about.
Yeah.
So it really does start with a thought, and the thought that we have in our brain, which can be influenced by all the data that we're ingesting.
Oh, yeah.
Whether that's on social media. So how do you suggest our audience practice starting with our thoughts?
Everyone's journey is going to look a little bit differently. I get that. For me, when I left traditional Christianity, I was directed to secular Buddhism. But I just kind of dove headfirst. I started practicing meditation. It has helped me immensely. Understanding just the core teachings that the Buddha taught, the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path, those two things are what changed the way I see the world around me. In my mind, that's how I'm practicing these virtue ethics. And Buddhism definitely influences my decision-making process.
Will you explain what you just said, the four?
So that would take, maybe we'll meet up again and I can go over them a little bit more. But the Four Noble Truths, basically the Buddha is searching for the cause of suffering. He's recognized that everyone suffers and he wants to know why. And so the Four Noble Truths explore that. And the basis of it is We suffer because we want the world to be different than it is. We suffer because the way the world is different than what we want. You can take that in so many different directions, and many different theologians have. But the basis for our suffering is unwillingness to accept life for what it really is. And then the eightfold path is basically steps on right ways to think, right ways to act, right ways to, basically every aspect of your life, to do it with intention, to do it with wisdom. So when you go through these steps and when you're learning about kind of the basics of Buddhism, that's what it goes through. It just talks about being a good person and understanding the world for what it really is and accepting that.
I love it. And we would hear this from other philosophers. I mean, I've heard Eckhart Tolle, kind of talk about accepting reality. I think one of the really big problems that we saw it through the pandemic, is people could not accept reality.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing. I mean, this we could talk for hours about. Our societies today cannot accept reality, like what their reality is. Yes, there is such a thing as critical race theory. So you can be angry and suffer and make yourself suffer over that, or you can learn about it, accept it, and understand realities, regardless of what you want it to be.
Yeah.
Is that true?
Yeah. A simple way to look at this is, if a loved one passes away, you're suffering because you want them to be alive still. And that's where the source of a lot of this grief comes from, is because you miss that person in your life and you wish that they were still there with you. But if you can accept that they're gone, recognize that this life is transitory and that one day we'll all be gone too. And when we see it for what it really is, we can look at those moments that we had with this person that has passed and say, they're gone and I'm sad that they're gone, but I had so many great memories with them while they were here. You can reframe the way you're looking at a situation to recognize what it is without wanting to change it. Now, that doesn't mean you can't have goals and work for things in the future, but when something is causing you pain and suffering, it's because we're looking at it the wrong way. And we're not seeing it for what it really is.
I love it. I think that's a great place to end this episode.
Sounds good.
I think we're going to need future episodes to explore. But thank you, Scott, for taking time with me, and we'll do it again.
Anytime. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
I hope that you enjoyed this conversation that I had with Gary Stone over at Topic Discuss about morality. As I said at the intro, go check out his podcast. He's a thoughtful guy, and he has a lot of great things to say about a wide variety of subjects. If you're interested in following the other podcast that I'm part of that I did mention in this interview, you can go and look us up. We're called the 12-Sided Guys, and it's an actual play Dungeons and Dragons podcast where we play Dungeons and Dragons, we tell a funny story, and we do the rolls right there. It's a great time. My audience here might not overlap too well with that, but if it's something that you're interested in, I'm going to put a link in the episode description. As always, thank you so much for listening. The biggest takeaway I hope that the listener would take from this episode is that we should all live more examined lives, to constantly be trying to be a better person and to make this world a better place. I hope that you have an excellent day.